quickly. Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin JARROLD. I'm the Chief of International Program Development with the GVF, the Global VSAT Forum. This presentation this afternoon has been developed in part by me and in part by the guy that currently chairs our cybersecurity task force, which is the main subject I'll be addressing this afternoon. That individual actually works with Cisco Tactical Operations, as you can see on the slide. Now, let me just begin by asking the audience one question. Is there anybody in the room from the satellite industry? A satellite operator, a satellite network provider perhaps, a satellite equipment manufacturer? No. Okay, perhaps in fairness, that was more or less what I actually expected. Hopefully in the future, in terms of addressing the subject of cybersecurity in contexts of events such as this, that will evolve. Now, perhaps you are wondering why I, representing an organization which itself represents the global satellite communications industry, is actually in attendance at an event such as this. Well, in part, we were invited, and to the organizers, thank you. But in part, as I will explore over the next 20 minutes or so, the issue of cybersecurity has come to assume an increasingly critical position and profile within the broad satellite communications world. But first, a little bit more about the organization for which I work, the GVF. Putting it simply, we are the single and unified voice of the global satellite communications industry. We are approaching our 20th birthday, and when we were founded, almost 20 years ago, we began a process of bringing together organizations engaged in the delivery of advanced broadband and narrowband satellite services, delivering those services to the consumer market, to commerce, to government, to enterprises worldwide. We were founded in London. We now have grown to cover more than 100 countries with a membership in excess of 200 member organizations. We are independent. We are a consensus-based industry organization. We are non-partisan, and we are non-profit. Now, our broad-based membership represents every major region of the world, every sector of the satellite industry, and I'd like to run through a few of those now. We cover the fixed satellite services market, the mobile satellite operator market, satellite network operators, the owners and operators of teleports, which are very, very large earth stations. It's the kind of image of the satellite industry with which perhaps those of you not particularly familiar with the industry might be the more familiar, seeing these large earth stations with many, many antennas, some of which are very, very large in size. That's probably one of the more common images of the satellite communications industry for those not familiar with the industry. We also represent the earth station manufacturers who manufacture not only the equipment, the really, really big teleports, but manufacture equipment down to much, much smaller terminals. Terminals these days that include antennas of some 60 or 75 centimeters in diameter in certain sorts of circumstances, using certain parts of the satellite radio frequency spectrum and for certain types of satellite-based services. We also represent the system integrators, the companies that actually put together the different physical hardware components together with the service delivery that is going to be put through a particular earth station. We also represent the value-added service providers, enhanced service providers, telecoms carriers, like the likes of BT in the UK and the existing incumbent telecom operators that's existed over many, many years, We also cover consultancies that are interested in the communications arena, law firms, and indeed the users of satellite services. So what exactly do we do? Well, over the years, we've invested a great deal of resources to promote satellite communications, to promote the industry's interests. And in order to achieve that, one of the approaches which we use to actually try to achieve that is that we have a number of operational, highly dynamic working groups. And these are used by the GVF membership to advance the priorities of the industry, to advance its initiatives, and to develop and advance its solutions. We have, for example, a regulatory working group. Now, historically, that has focused on areas of satellite operation that interface with government policies, with government or regulatory agency regulations affecting satellite communications. We have other working groups that cover type approvals, equipment mutual recognition arrangements. Others, like the Maritime Satcom Forum, that focuses specifically on one of the key end-user industries of satellite communications. We deliver education and training on satellite equipment installation and so on. We focus on the radio frequency side of satellite communications through our Satellite Spectrum Initiative. Again, focusing on one of the areas that is a key end-user arena for satellite communications to fulfill mission-critical requirements. That falls under the heading of our humanitarian assistance and disaster response environment. We also, of course, have our cybersecurity task force. But the reason that I cite some of these other areas is that increasingly there's an observable pattern that issues relating to cybersecurity are making their way into the agendas of these various other environments. For example, how could a non-governmental organization going very quickly into an area affected by a natural disaster? For such an organization, satellite communications is an absolute mission-critical imperative. But it's not enough to ensure that the equipment they have is installed properly, that it's pointing at the right satellite, it's working most efficiently and practically to fulfill those mission-critical requirements of the organization. But equally, that equipment, it needs to be secure against any form of cyber attack. Imagine a situation in a highly conflict-ridden part of the world where a non-governmental organization comes in to assist a government with a disaster response environment. But there are other elements that would like to see that response, those efforts, disrupted. One of the opportunities, one of the mechanisms they could use is to attack through cyberspace. All in all, the issue of cybersecurity is coming in more and more and more into these various other areas. That's just one of the reasons why we have established our own cybersecurity task force. Now, I've selected here examples of a number of collaborations and various types of events that the GVF, in fact, in this particular case, these are examples of things in which I personally have been directly involved, because I am just one member of a 3-person secretariat that runs the organization. This is a range of different events, a range of different organizations, excuse me, with which I personally have been involved, and where, to varying degrees, issues relating to cybersecurity and satellite have joined the rest of the satellite-related agenda common to many of these situations. I cited a moment ago the example of a humanitarian crisis. Recently, GVF was one of the organizations that signed up with the United Nations Emergency Telecommunications Cluster and World Food Programme to actually bring new satellite-based solutions into this particular space. But again, underpinning it are issues relating to cybersecurity. There's a whole host of events here to do with various satellite end-user markets, oil and gas, cellular backhaul, aeronautical connectivity, all of which have agendas within which cybersecurity is assuming an increasingly high focus. You see on there, on the left-hand side, a small, see if I can point to it here. Can't quite get onto the screen. It's an event called CABSAT, anyway, during which we run the GVS satellite hub, during which one particular year we were approached by the broadcasting company in the Middle East, Al Jazeera. They wanted to cover the work that we were doing on equipment installation training related to issues of radio frequency interference. And this is something that the GVF has been very, very heavily involved with. For example, with, you see the logo in the middle, the ITU, another UN agency, the International Telecommunication Union. That has been one of our major foci. But again, issues relating to cybersecurity are joining other, what might loosely be described as interference-related issues, because after all, a cyber attack is a clear mechanism by which an additional vector of interference can occur into the mission-critical operations, not only of the provider of the satellite service, but also of the user of the satellite service. Now, extending that theme, you'll see on there a couple of logos relating to Digital Ship. Now, Digital Ship is an organization which actually produces information about the increasing digitization of the maritime world, including satellite. It also runs a number of events. I've been involved in a number of those events. And I'm going to focus for the next few slides specifically on the maritime environment as one of the key end users of satellite services. Now, it, for example, is one of those commercial areas where cybersecurity now looms very large on the corporate agenda. Back at the beginning of this year, February I think it was, a number of the maritime industry associations collaborated together to produce their own industry-focused event to promote guidelines on cybersecurity on board ships. I was involved in a number of workshops that occurred at Digital Ship in Athens in June. One of my colleagues was involved at a parallel event happening in Hamburg just at the beginning of last month. The focus of these was to look at cybersecurity within the maritime context. The very existence of these programs is a further index of the extent to which various industries are now realizing that cybersecurity issues are a key part of their overall corporate agenda. Cannot be looked at as a side issue, cannot be looked at as an overhead, but must be looked at from the point of view of being central to commercial operations and the protection of those operations. Maritime is a particularly interesting one, but only one example, as I say. And one of the questions that was actually addressed at this workshop was how can maritime interests, the users of satellite services being mission critical to their operations, how can they most effectively collaborate with satellite communications solutions vendors to defend against escalating cyber threats across an increasingly diverse ecosystem of networks used to support not only SATCOM itself, but also navigation, tracking, and other mission critical services. Consider this: an oil tanker, a liquid natural gas carrier, a dry bulk carrier, whatever type of vessel we're talking about, it's more than simply a transportation platform or a pleasure craft. They are, in essence today, floating networks of interconnected communication, control, and information devices, ranging from switches, actuators, and valves, through to propulsion and maneuvering systems, and connected navigation and positioning equipment. There's the automatic identification system that ships have to carry to actually identify which vessel they are. Increasingly, navigation is becoming electronic. The days of the paper chart are slowly disappearing. The electronic chart display and information system, relatively new, being introduced across the industry, at least as far as vessels of a certain size are concerned, can be continually updated. It's computer-based, it's network-based, it's ones and zeros based, and potentially hackable. The same applies to GPS and to lots of other tools that are actually used in the maritime space. If you think of a cruise ship, it can also address certain other issues as well. Think of crew welfare on board and an individual member of the crew. Bring your own device. Interfaces with the ship's own network, another potential source of threat. A passenger on a cruise liner could be bring your own device, it could be using onboard internet systems, equally can introduce potential threats into maritime networks. It became very clear, fortunately, during these various workshops that the equipment manufacturers, service providers, and the maritime industry's own stakeholders are working together to reinforce cybersecurity for an environment that's increasingly characterized by satellite-enabled IoT innovations and ship-to-shore cloud connectivity. These kinds of developments are actually transforming the maritime space. They're transforming the operation of maritime companies because they can now more efficiently track and manage their fleets, their cargoes, and their crews. Now, consider the last point here. Given that the cloud brings significant business efficiencies, enhanced operational effectiveness, brings improved levels of competition in an overheads-sensitive maritime sector, any weakness in an onboard network can arise even through something as simple as a piece of original equipment manufactured device has never ever had its security access codes updated. Simply the default is used. It never actually occurs to actually change passwords. Some of these devices on board, they provide primary communications functions, like, for example, a crew member's smartphone or a cruise line passenger's smartphone. Others aren't necessarily directly in the ICT loop, but they're connected to the network. Let's say a tank monitor aboard a liquid natural gas carrier. But all of these are potential sources of weakness. Now we're in a situation where a culture of cyber awareness, the necessity for cyber security, is actually developing. We've heard reference to this particular expression, a culture of cyber security, before in this room this afternoon. And fortunately, that is now expanding. Hence, the GVFs, from its side, as the organization representing the providers of equipment and the providers of solutions, has actually established its own cybersecurity task force. Its job being to facilitate the application of industry practices that enhance security without reducing the utility and performance of VSAT, very small aperture-based solutions. Let's look at what the media has been saying over the last couple of years about the cybersecurity in the satellite environment. Intel Crawler, at the beginning of January 2014, carried a report detailing specific vulnerabilities, largely pertaining to the presence of the use of default passwords only. CERT-CC published a bulletin on one particular satellite technology, opening up doubts about the security of its firmware. We, as I said, in response to some of these announcements, identified that a response from the industry was required. It was clear as far as the industry was concerned that it was only GVF that was positioned to actually assume the role of establishing an appropriate task force. And indeed, we did so. The work of the task force is being facilitated at two levels. The GVF product security baseline, which is designed for organizations that develop and produce satellite terminal hardware and software, such as the modems and the hub equipment, and also the satellite service provider security specification, developed for the service providers that sell satellite-based connectivity. Further coverage in the media. IOActive published a widely known report, said, hey, satellite industry, you got to wake up. And interestingly, in terms of the pervasive way in which this information got into the wider, before the eyes of the wider world, was through various types of the media. There was a huge media uptake on this story, through the BBC, through Wired magazine, through the Christian Science Monitor, a total 60+ articles on this particular issue about these vulnerabilities were actually in wide circulation. So, in brief, because it isn't really possible in this particular context to go into the fine detail of either the product security baseline or the other document to which I referred, but I can say this. It's a document that's living. It's continually being enhanced. It's intended to guide how products on both hardware and software are developed by the satellite industry, including designing the hardware or software product with security as a priority from the outset, from the very beginning, providing for secure management and configuration, and establishing transparent methods to facilitate the reporting and response to potential security vulnerabilities in satellite products. This is a voluntary specification. It was produced on a consensus basis. We had full representation from right the way across our membership, from vendors, from network operators, and indeed from end users. It details requirements and recommendations for all satellite hardware and software that supports or transmits over IP version 4 or IP version 6 networks, and provides detailed requirements and recommendations for all VSAT equipment and software vendors for vulnerability management and disclosure, issues that we have heard about already in this room this afternoon. The members of our task force have full access to this specification and are beginning now its implementation. Implementation as soon as possible being something of an imperative, because we don't know, we can't foresee when vulnerabilities are going to be identified and when they're going to be detailed, and more importantly, when they are going to be exploited. And I come back again to this particular phrase, culture of security. It's got to happen, but its cost is a sensitivity. Because you may think, in not being particularly familiar with the satellite world, that the cost of one of these very small aperture terminals, the means of gaining access to networks over satellite, is an incredibly expensive issue. Going back to one of my earlier slides of the various logos, one of the events I was at, it was in Ethiopia 3 weeks ago. One of the prevailing issues about access to satellite communications are issues relating to cost, the cost of terminal equipment. But terminal equipment, the pattern over the years has been down and down and down and down. In fact, it is quite possible now to secure all the various components of a satellite terminal. You're talking in the hundreds of dollars, not the thousands of dollars. So access to satellite equipment, the ability to purchase and use it, is getting cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. So therefore, anything that adds in significantly to that pattern of declining costs is going to be looked at in very, very close detail. But as part of the culture of security, that view that it's something that, oh, it's going to add a little bit more cost, therefore we can't really do it, that has got to be overcome. That's one side of this culture of security. The second document to which I referred, it builds on the PSB. It establishes how satellite service providers can protect networks and critical components of their infrastructure, including ensuring that personnel have sufficient training on security. And I cited earlier on the work that we're doing in training related to the installation of satellite equipment and the operation of satellite equipment. I strongly suspect that in the near future, that training will actually grow to involve and include cybersecurity related issues as well. So this training on security must ensure that networks are instrumented to detect and enable effective response to potential attacks and to establish incident response procedures within the organization. Just to wrap up on these various points. In the satellite industry, we're conscious that security scrutiny on us is higher than it's ever been. Exploitation of systems by the bad guys is being widely discussed. And naturally, we have to assume that those bad guys are paying close attention as well. And any information they could derive, any information they could obtain about our tactics, about our strategies to challenge what they are trying to do would, of course, be useful information for them. That's exactly why my remarks about the nature of the PSB and the SSPSEC have been vague, not in very, very close detail, because we don't want any knowledge or appreciation of what the industry is doing to leak out to the bad guys, because they will be able to manipulate that information to their own advantage. So essentially, the GVF Cybersecurity Task Force exists as a coordination center for the industry for the development and dissemination of satellite security knowledge. And it seeks to encourage and to support vendors in their work and the network operators in their work for the implementation of robust protection and to abandon any discredited practices if they still exist. And our purpose is to strengthen the satellite stakeholder community collaboration and preparation for improved levels of cybersecurity. To continue to work on these living documents as best practice guidelines and to fully facilitate coordination within the industry, across the industry, with our user groups and with governments. Essentially, the closing message is that the satellite industry is innovating. It's staying proactive, and we recognize this as a vitally important front. Thank you. I'll take questions.
Are there any questions from the audience? Well, I have one. I mean, I remember some of these sort of disaster spy movies where one of the first things that happen is that the satellite gets taken over and it shoots lasers down onto. Well, that's a little bit exaggerated, or that it knocks out a significant part of the necessary communication system. In your case, you're saying that everybody who's out in the ocean with valuable cargo and with mission-critical systems running on board their ships is at risk from faults or hacks or breaches in the satellite
No
system.
different really to any other sort of environment within which commercial satellite communications are an essential part of the operation. It's just that something in the middle of the ocean, which otherwise might generally be thought of as being quite isolated, it's not isolated. Nothing is isolated these days. An aircraft at 35,000 feet, anybody that travelled on Emirates, for example, or any of the other airlines now that enable you to sit in your seat. And you don't have to keep your smartphone off or have it in flight mode.
Well, this is Wi-Fi in the air.
Yeah, because just above your seat there is a femto or a picocell of a Wi-Fi network. And that Wi-Fi network then feeds through to an onboard, very small aperture terminal satellite system. so that any call you're making is going over a VSAT network via a satellite at 36,000 kilometers. So when you're at 35,000 feet, you're actually dependent on something at 36,000 kilometers. Similarly, you could be browsing. You could be updating your Facebook status. Many, many airlines now, in fact, there's something of the order of approaching 50 either already having implemented or in process of implementing these kinds of services, very often at no additional charge. Some instances.
But those airlines then also have they're one big bring your own device zoo.
Absolutely.
And if
yes.
you brought anything on board except a Samsung 7, which you're not allowed to bring on board, but you could is it possible that someone could bring on the cyber equivalent of a Samsung 7, not something that'll physically catch fire, but something that could seriously harm
But of course,
the system?
then we're operating in a context where there are multiple facets of responsibility for securing the cyberspace as far as that particular device is concerned. Because, okay, you're using the aircraft's internal Wi-Fi network, you're then using the aircraft's own very small aperture terminal, you're also using the satellite network provider service, you're actually using the satellite itself, you're also ultimately using your own operator, your own cell phone operator.
Yeah, so we are sort of...
there are multiple levels of responsibility.
We are sort of in the James Bond movie scenario where someone gets aboard with the poisonous smartphone, which in turn shuts down the communication systems of everybody on the plane, allowing, I don't know, terrorists to hijack the CEO of a big company who's on the same flight. That sort of thing is possible then.
It's not inconceivable. Put it that way. But in exactly the same way as we have to accept that it is conceivable that any sort of network that promises all sorts of protection through firewalls, through passwords, encryption, and so on and so forth, hey, how could that have happened? I found it strangely perverse a few weeks ago when it was announced that Yahoo had been hacked. You would think that the likes of Yahoo will be one of the last organizations in the world to potentially succumb to attack. And yet it does, because pretty much anything's hackable. If that wasn't the case, then maybe we wouldn't be all gathered here having this discussion.
Has anyone been inspired to ask a question from the audience? No. Okay. Yeah, well, believe it or not. I'll give you my mic.
How fast actually can cybersecurity of system of a satellite can adapt to new changes in some cybersecurity breaches and zero-day attacks?
There is no reason why it need be any slower in effect than over a purely terrestrial network.
Okay, so the changes can be implemented just the next day or in a few hours?
Oh yes, yes. That's what we're working towards anyway. Yes, absolutely. There's no tangible difference otherwise.
Yeah, but the embedded systems on board a satellite, of course, are not that easy. I mean, unless you want to boost the space shuttle into geosynchronous orbit, you're not gonna...
No, it doesn't require a guy with a wrench physically going to...
Okay.
In fact, the space shuttle couldn't get to the altitude anyway.
Aren't there sensors and things that are fastened on with a wrench, and the only way...
Not when it comes... Communication satellites at 36,000 kilometers are designed to have a lifespan of around about 15 to 17 years that certainly don't require any maintenance of that type. The kinds of changes we're all talking about here are software-based changes that will be done through the usual channels. Right.
Well, now unless there are more interesting questions. Wait. You have to, because this is all being recorded and streamed, So if you want to become world famous in the cybersecurity community, your question.
I want to ask what operating system is mostly used in satellites? It's Linux, Windows, or something special?
It will vary between different network providers, vary between different satellite operators. But the point is, fundamentally, think in terms of the satellite as being more likely than not as a bent pipe, so it's simply carrying the traffic of the original customer.
It's a suspicious question. Why does he want to know? Sure.
But basically, what's the difference between satellite and just ordinary server standing, I don't know, somewhere?
Oh, there isn't. It's just that. It's now a recognition from a stronger and firmer recognition from the satellite industry that it's playing its role along with the role played by its own customers in terms of securing the satellite security, the cyber security of networks that are trafficked via satellite.
Okay, but in this case, why, according to the report, why the state of the security in case of satellites is so much worse than what we're having? Like,
I don't think it's certainly not any worse. It's simply it's gained this very, very high profile because the extent to which people outside of the satellite community are a little aware of what satellite does. Satellite is something that is thought to be, well, it is in many ways. It's very remote. It is very, very remote in space. It's a recognition that satellite systems, like any other software-based systems, are vulnerable to cyber attack, but to no greater extent than any other. It's just that it's picked up because you can envisage, see, almost a more romantically think about a satellite in orbit than you can, let's say, about switches buried underground or within massive points of presence, for example. That's why. I mean, satellites have such a high profile in a way, because we think of military satellites, we think of weather satellites, we think of satellites that bring us a football match from the other side of the planet. And the satellites do have a high profile, but not particularly that well understood. But just like any system based on software, it's vulnerable. No more so, no less so, but it gets the attention because satellites have that profile in our lives.
Well, okay. Anyone else? This is getting livelier. People are asking questions.
I'm
anyway,
I'm pleased, but surprised.
I suppose that another thing that has been discovered is that, you know, when you get tired of sort of putting funny faces on thousands of other people's computers or whatever hackers do, then you discover this is a new area to have fun with the satellites, and an extremely dangerous area for fun and games.
Absolutely, yes. It's really has the potential actually to interfere with simultaneously with so many different facets of lives. So we do have to take it extremely seriously.
Okay, coffee break. Back, but you had a follow-up? Okay, come on. I'll give you a chance. We have a coffee break. Those of you who want to, the coffee I think is back there.
Okay. Another question.
Yeah, if I'm allowed, actually.
Yeah.
So is there any kind of auditing mechanism for satellites?
Any sort of what, sorry?
Auditing, checking the security and anything. So is there any kind of official procedures for that kind of stuff? Or every manufacturer doing it itself and there's nothing there?
Yes, pre-existing, yes, but we're trying to develop and extend and improve that. That was the reason behind the establishment of the Cybersecurity Task Force and the reason for engaging on the consensus basis on which the organization works, extending that to cover cybersecurity issues. So the two documents that the task force has actually produced is designed to not only develop a general culture of cybersecurity, but actually to set down certain specifications, recommendations as to how that can be uniformly dealt with across the industry.
Is it publicly available, these documents, or are
these documents are not publicly available, no. They are designed to be tools for the industry itself. If they became publicly available, the bad guys would get hold of them.
Okay, I'm going to just be arbitrary and say it's time for coffee for everyone, although the way people are asking questions, it seems the caffeine is already circulating in the bloodstreams here. We have something for you.